Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Can we just check that everybody can hear me? Was that a thumbs up? Yeah, I saw one thumbs up. Well, good afternoon and welcome to this event. I want to say a few words on behalf of SRUC. First of all, how delighted we are to be hosting the Equine Strangles Awareness webinar, and we welcome Nick de Brauwere, our speaker from Redwings Horse Sanctuary. You'll be hearing a bit from Nick later on. My name is David Hopkins. I'm Dean of the Central Faculty of SRUC, which means I have the leadership responsibility for SRUC's education, research and training activities across central Scotland. It doesn't mean that I know very much at all about the equestrian or equine sector, but I am guided and helped by some very intelligent and knowledgeable people on that subject. Since I have the floor just for a few minutes, I want to just take this opportunity to say a few things about SRUC and in particular pick up some of our interests in horses. Some of you, but perhaps not everybody, will be aware that SRUC is Scotland's only higher and further education institution specialising in the natural economy. We operate from a series of education campuses, research and veterinary disease surveillance centres, farms, rural business and advisory and consultancy offices across Scotland. And in fact, we're present on about 40 sites in Scotland. Much of our equestrian activities focused on our Oakridge campus in West Lothian. And here we have a wide range of further and higher education and training programs, including in horse care, equine studies, animal care and veterinary nursing, which are relevant to us this afternoon. We're very pleased to be launching a new and Scotland's first degree level programme in equine science and management this year. And also through our partnership with the Scottish Racing Academy, we offer certificate level education on a programme aligned to the needs of the horse racing industry. So Oakridge is definitely embedded in the equine and equestrian sector and something that we're very proud of. In particular, many people will know that Oakridge is the home of the Scottish National Equestrian Centre. This is a partnership with Horse Scotland and the National Lottery. It's operated by SRUC as a sporting competition and training venue. Now, I'd have to say that in recent times, COVID has not been particularly kind to the National Equestrian Centre. And after a long period of closure and only intermittent operation, I'm pleased to say that we are now back to nearly full operation with a new staff team, a new business plan, and a much closer working partnership with Horse Scotland. And indeed, this is the first of two equestrian gigs that I'm on this afternoon because in a short while, I have to head off to attend a meeting of the Horse Scotland members where I want to start taking forward the developments in the National Equestrian Centre with the wider equestrian sector. The other area of SRUC I just wanted to introduce because they're in every way as important to today's event is SRUC's veterinary services. Now, veterinary services within SRUC undertakes animal disease surveillance on behalf of the Scottish Government, operating from centres around Scotland. Testing is based at the Veterinary and Analytical Laboratory, Pentland Science Park. And importantly, through the veterinary services, SRUC supports the veterinary practices and their clients around the whole of the UK, providing diagnostic testing for animal diseases, as well as operating national animal health schemes. So let's move on to Strangles Awareness. SRUC is one of the collaborators in Strangles Awareness Week through the Premium Assured Strangles Scheme, the PASS scheme. This developed by SRUC Veterinary Services and supported by BHS Scotland. The scheme is based on biosecurity protocols and supports yards to help reduce the risk of strangles outbreaks. SRUC's Oakridge Yard is a PASS member, and our students are learning about the importance of preventing strangles as there are thought to be something in the region of 600 outbreaks in the UK annually. Final 2 points from me. Please sign up to Strangles Awareness Week, which runs from the 2nd to the 8th of May, 2nd to the 8th of May, to show your support. Help to spread the word so that we can help reduce the spread of this disease is important. I understand that some of our students will have been working on videos and social media content. Redwings also has some excellent resources available for yards and horse owners, so please take a look at their webpage. And we'll be adding the links to the chat. So that's enough from me. We're delighted to welcome our speaker this afternoon, Nick de Brauwere, who's an expert in strangles and head of welfare and behaviour at Redwings Horse Sanctuary, as well as being chair of the National Equine Welfare Council. We have about 40 minutes presentation and then followed by a session of questions and answers. And if you could write your questions in the chat, then we'll pick them up at the end. So I'll stop now. Thank you very much for listening and hand over to Nick.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the support for the development of this year's Strangles Awareness Week campaign. I think the week has really developed into something quite a lot bigger than we'd initially expected, on the basis that actually Strangles seems to strike a chord with a lot of organisations and a lot of horse owners, and now it has support across the UK and even internationally. The week is being adapted to the groups that are trying to address strangles in their own countries. And the thing that I would like to try and do today is get across to everyone not only a deeper understanding of strangles, but also to let strangles awareness and knowledge help you be a better horse owner and a better horse keeper in protecting your horses against all sorts of diseases. So the theme of the talk is really about much more than just strangles, but we'll use strangles as a fantastic way of illustrating how disease management and disease knowledge can make us better horse keepers. So what I'm going to do is start sharing the presentation, and I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat, but if I don't spot the questions, you are welcome to interrupt me, but otherwise we will have some time at the end to talk about the questions that my presentation has thrown up. So I'm going to try and avoid death by PowerPoint, but just to pick up where David left off, the Strangles Awareness Week this year is only a few weeks away now, and individuals can participate in the challenge this year is the temperature check challenge, where people can understand what the normal and the average temperature is for their own horses, but also to use it as a talking point on yards and even events to increase awareness. And for those of you who follow the FEI world, you'll have noticed that after the horrendous outbreak of EHV that caused the loss of 8 horses and put far more at risk after an event in Valencia last year, they are now mandating that competitors actually record their horse's temperature before, during and after events, because temperature is actually a very useful sign that something's amiss, and whether that's a strangles infection brewing or something else, it can often be the first indicator that there's something amiss and that we might need either to isolate our horses and or get the vets involved. So that's kind of the thrust and the theme of this year's week, but it all comes back to trying to give horse owners and keepers as many tools as possible to keep strangles off their yard and away from their horse. And if they are unfortunate enough to contract strangles, to then have the ability to bring that infection and that outbreak under control as quickly as possible. So we're going to really split the talk into a couple of chunks, and we'll move through those at a different pace. Sorry, just have to rescue something from my hound. And if you want to know more about any of the sections that I've covered, maybe in a little bit too much speed today, then you're welcome to come back to me and we will try and give you more answers to your questions. Otherwise, we potentially could be here all day, which I think most of you have busy lives and horses to look after. So initially, I'm just going to talk a bit about the disease strangles, and the the fact that Strangles strikes fear into so many horse owners when you talk about it or even just mention the word is probably an indicator of how common it is and how much of a part of the horse world this disease is. That pretty much everyone who has a horse will have heard of Strangles, even if they haven't had the misfortune of suffering it in their horses. So what we really would like to see is that awareness of Strangles actually helps people prevent Strangles affecting their horses, rather than just knowing more about it so that when it happens, they can deal with it and maybe save on a few vet bills. It is actually entirely possible to stop Strangles getting to your horse, particularly now with vaccines coming on stream that will give us more than just one type of vaccine to have as a toolkit. But actually, even the vaccine people are saying that it's only part of the way to keep the disease away. And actually far more effective is just the general behavior of horse owners, yard managers, and the equestrian professionals is basically everyone from your farrier, your chiropractors, your vets, your equine dentists, as well as maybe coaches and transporters and people delivering stuff to your yard. And if everyone plays their role, it will help keep Strangles away and other diseases too. So we did a big survey at Redwings before we launched our Strangles campaign, and a lot of that was off the back of years of collaboration and learning from the Animal Health Trust, which is sadly now closed due to financial problems. And the people that were part of the infectious disease team at the Animal Health Trust really are world experts on Strangles, and none as much as Andrew Waller. And really what we know is that if people understand the important parts about Strangles, they can put in place strategies that actually can keep Strangles away. And that is something that we saw at Redwings, both in keeping Strangles away from our main herd for the best part of 20 years, as well as when we did have an outbreak, managing to bring that outbreak under control and protecting the majority of our horses at Redwings by implementing the stuff that we'd learned over the last 20 years. So knowledge, when it's applied, is incredibly powerful for keeping disease away from our horses. So why does Strangles matter? Well, I think when we hear about people talking about outbreaks and infections, and they say, well, you know, there were only 2 horses on the yard got it and the other horses didn't get it. That can be for all number of reasons, which could be some kind of previous immunity in the other horses, some successes with how the disease was contained, a bit of luck. But in truth, if you have horses that are naive or vulnerable to Strangles, in other words, they haven't got a working immunity, Strangles will infect almost every horse in that group once the infection gets into the first horse. So it has almost 100% infection rate. And when studies are done, this is sort of proven again and again and again that actually Strangles will work its way through a herd. Just it takes a bit of time sometimes to do it, but it will eventually catch up with every horse in the herd. And recently I've been working with some people down on some moorland, and that's exactly the experience that they've had. It's important to recognize that Strangles doesn't care whether your horse is the rescue, the rehomed horse from Redwings or the RSPCA, or your horse that you spent a huge amount or bred yourself at home. A horse is a horse is a horse as far as Strangles is concerned, and if they can get into your horse's body, the bacteria will do their damnedest to cause infection there. So we always have to remember that every creature on the planet, whether they're ones that we like or don't like, has this inbuilt urge to survive and to reproduce. So Strangles will only really be looking to protect the future interests of Strangles. And whilst bacteria and viruses don't have conscious thought and they can't have strategies, what we can perhaps say we learned from COVID is that mutations, which is really accidents each time a bug reproduces, whether it's a virus or bacteria, each time they reproduce, some of the offspring will have genetic mutations. Most of those mean that the bug can't survive and it dies off, and we never even know about that mutation. But every now and then one of the mutations turns out to actually be more successful at surviving in that environment than its parents were. And this process of evolution is just a consequence of the natural accidents of genetic mutations. But when it comes to strangles, mutations are slower than, for example, COVID, but they do happen. And so every time strangles gets into a new horse, the bacteria that take hold and that multiply will have mutations happening, and eventually we will find that new strains of strangles will emerge. So the whole aim of strangles, if we can say that, is to look after strangles and nobody else. So when we address strangles, we really have to remember that strangles doesn't care where the horse lives or who owns it, and therefore we have to always work. And the theme of today's talk, really about being better horse keepers, comes back to recognizing that all infectious diseases will not discriminate. And therefore, if you have 10 horses on a yard, you need to look at all 10 horses as a herd. If you have 150 horses on a big yard, that is a herd of 150 horses. And if we can work around that concept and get the collaboration, the communication, the sharing of information, the support and the respect when other people are struggling, that is the key to managing all sorts of problems, whether it's strangles or equine flu or worms or lice or mites. The other thing that we find with strangles is that people will either be terrified of it, or they will say that, nah, all horses just need to get strangles. Once they've had strangles, they'll be immune for life, and then that's fine. So one of the things we know is that horses will not be immune for life, but what we do know is that some horses will have immunity that lasts a lot longer than the antibodies that we can measure in the blood. So immunity to strangles is quite complicated, and that's why it's been so hard to come up with a working vaccine. But in the end, horses that have had strangles will be able to get strangles again over time. And so it's important to recognize that we have to take steps to protect our horses from catching strangles a second time, and to protect our horses from catching strangles the first time. Because when they do get strangles, up to 1 in 5 of those horses can have complications. That can include having a really tough time during the disease. And I'll show you some photos later on that demonstrate the kind of suffering that the animals endure. And it's not unknown for horses to die of strangles. And the photo in this slide is actually of a young foal where strangles managed to get into the lymph glands lower down at the opening to her chest and at the front, where the legs, the front legs and the neck meet and go into the chest. And one of those abscesses burst into her esophagus instead of out through the skin. And then it eventually burst out through the skin as well, which was impossible for us to fix. And so we had to put her to sleep. And out of all the foals we had, there was nothing different about Norma compared to the other foals. So you never know which horse that catches strangles is going to be the one that's not going to make it. And I think for that reason alone, it's worth taking steps to protect your own horses from catching strangles, because we can't give you anything to give you a reassurance that your horse is going to be the one that's lucky, that's going to just go through it a couple of days and be quite unwell and then recover. And I suppose, again, if we look at COVID outbreak, everybody's experience will be different, and we'll see some people who had a small cold for a few days and other people who will have lost loved ones or know friends who've lost loved ones. And in the same sense, strangles isn't going to necessarily tell us who is going to be the most vulnerable and who's going to suffer the most. And the other thing that's really important with strangles is that actually after an outbreak, some horses will become carriers, and we'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. But those horses that continue to remain infectious are the reason why outbreaks can then jump from one herd to the next, whether that's a herd, 2 different herds on the same premises, or whether it's from one yard to a next. That is how the infection seems to be able to get out when all the horses look healthy and normal, and yet you suddenly find an outbreak starting on a yard. Okay, so when it comes to why strangles matters, I've kind of given you the bad news, but the good news is actually hopefully going to encourage you to take the active steps that I think will keep the disease away. So it is possible to eradicate strangles from a herd, so you can make sure that all the horses on a property are actually free from strangles, that they don't catch it again, and that they don't give it to anyone else. It is possible, in theory, to eradicate strangles from the UK, but that's going to take a long time and a lot more work. But there's nothing to say that you can't eradicate strangles. What we've also seen with research such as the Redwings Owners Survey and also other surveys that have gone on over the last 10, 20 years is that generally horse owners want to raise the standards of health of their horses, whether it's around strangles specifically or generally, and that they are receptive to ways in which they can improve what they do to their horses in order to improve the health and welfare of their horses. So what we have to do as professionals is give owners the knowledge and the tools so they can do this as easily as possible, so that actually they can take the steps they want to take. Otherwise, if it's too difficult, what we'll find is that people get exhausted, they give up, and then they are frustrated. And if we can get an approach on a yard to avoid strangles, then what you will find is actually that the horses on the yard in general will be healthier. There should be a better approach to worm management, for example, and that actually everyone on the yard will benefit. So it's not just about keeping strangles away. So what is strangles? Those of you who've been unfortunate enough to see strangles will probably know more than those who've never seen it before. But strangles is a bacterial infection, and it usually only affects the upper airways. So that is the nostrils, the throat of the horse. And the image here shows the areas of the head where there are lymph glands. So lymph glands are basically like police stations for the immune system. So when horses eat and drink and breathe, they are taking in all sorts of things from the environment, worms, bot eggs, dodgy food, bitter tasting ragwort, and dust and viruses and bacteria. And the function of the head is to keep as much of that as possible away. So, for example, if horses eat young ragwort, it's going to be bitter, they will probably spit it out. If horses drink water that tastes foul, they will stop drinking it. If horses inhale dust, it gets stuck to the mucosa in the head on the way up to the back of the head before they breathe it into their lungs. The tubules inside the head are designed to capture as much of the air movement as possible so that stuff can stick to the mucous membranes and the body can then eject the dust. And with that will be bacteria and viruses as well. The problem is that bacteria and viruses have also learned how to bypass this defense mechanism, and strangles actually specifically wants to get picked up by the immune system on the mucous membranes inside the nose and gets carried to the police station, which is the lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes are all the way around the back of the throat and underneath the jaw and at the base of the ear. And the heavy concentration of lymph nodes here is for this very purpose of cleansing everything that's coming in and filtering it. Strangles and other bugs actually would like to go to the police stations. And this is why we find that the focus of strangles infections is mostly around the head of the horse, because the battle between strangles and the horse's immune system actually happens inside these lymph glands. So the spread, because it is a disease that is bacteria are bigger than viruses. Bacteria struggle generally to be carried on the air, so they tend to be carried by direct contact from one sick horse to another. So one horse touching the snotty nose of another horse, but also indirectly through shared water tanks, shared feed bowls, coming into contact with the clothing of owners and vets that have been on a yard where there's strangles and maybe spent some time examining a horse that's got strangles, and then those bacteria can then jump onto the next horse if they have close contact. So indirect contact is an important part of how strangles gets from one horse to the next. And it does cause high morbidity. So that's what we said just now, the 100% infection rate in a herd of naive ponies. But it doesn't kill many of the horses. So whilst mortality is low, and we often talk of between 1% and 5% of horses could die of strangles, but it is still important to remember that we can't predict who we're going to lose. And it specifically works a way around the initial part of the immune system. And importantly, in order to know that it can get from horse A to horse B, Strangles can actually survive in the environment for quite a long period of time if the conditions are favorable. And we used to say up to 2 years, but what we've discovered is it varies a huge amount. So for example, if it gets in the middle of winter into a water tank, it can survive easily for 6 weeks, even if the water freezes from time to time. But if a horse smears its snotty nose on a fence post in springtime and the sun is out, usually the layer of bacteria exposed to the sun will be dead in less than an hour. But a big thick lump of snot on a fence post might take a couple of days before it dehydrates and the sun actually kills it off. But it really depends on where in the environment the Strangles ends up as to how long it can persist. But this is one of the reasons why outbreaks tend to be quite complicated to understand, because the nature of each outbreak will be different, and it can sometimes spread like wildfire through a herd of young horses that share a water tank. And other times it can just grumble on and slow, just 2 or 3 horses are affected, and then suddenly it pops up on a different part of the yard a month later. And this is always because the combination of how much Strangles gets into the environment, the movement of horses, was it direct or indirect contact? Did the environment manage to kill off the Strangles? That can mean that each outbreak has got its own unique characteristics. And that's why sometimes we don't always recognize that we have a Strangles outbreak on our hands until it's too late and it's really obvious that that's what we've got. So count yourselves lucky that this is a webinar, because normally if we did this in a room, I would be doing a quiz with you guys. But the symptoms of Strangles, normally people will say, oh yeah, abscesses bursting out. But I think it's important to recognize that actually the signs that we would see in the order in which they happen are a little bit different. And actually by the time we've got burst abscesses, Strangles is already quite a long way down the clinical route. So the first thing that will happen is that the horse will develop a fever. And we know that the fever in 99% of cases will actually happen 24 to 36 hours before the horse becomes contagious to other horses. So this is huge. And this is why this year we're talking about the temp check challenge as one of the ways that we can manage an outbreak by stopping it in its tracks, just by keeping a regular eye on our horse's temperatures. So everybody who's had a fever will know that when you've got a fever, you feel rubbish. And so the other symptom that we often notice soon after horses have a fever is that the animal looks dull and depressed. We may or may not get a nasal discharge, which will often start off as a bit thin and hard to notice. When it gets thick and yellow, that's usually because lymph nodes have already formed abscesses and have already burst. Horses will stop eating around about the time that the fever starts, but the more that the lymph glands at the back of the head swell up and get really large, and they're under huge amounts of pressure, so they become incredibly painful. So that's what then mostly causes horses to stop eating and why they have difficulty in swallowing. And that's why the disease has got its nickname of Strangles, because it is possible for these lymph nodes to get so big that horses can struggle to breathe, and certainly they won't be able to eat for a couple of days. And they become really miserable, and they go off all food, and they lose all interest in everything around them. And sometimes this will happen before any glands burst, so we can see this before pus comes out the head. And other times we'll already have some glands bursting, but our horses still seem to be very dull and depressed. And what we've found in our general experience is that as long as your horse looks rubbish, there's probably still a gland somewhere that has yet to burst. And as soon as the last abscess has burst, the horses seem to be much happier. The misery seems to come from the pain of a gland that hasn't yet burst. Once these glands burst, they seem to be much, much happier. And even if they still end up with huge amounts of pus coming out of their nose and out of the glands at the bottom of their head and all that, they actually seem to be quite happy horses, and they'll go back to grazing and go back to being the horse that you know. And so the order in which these things happen is sometimes a bit confusing, but I think it's helpful to recognize that if your horse is still dull and depressed, you've still got some way to go before the last abscesses have burst. So what can we do to help horses with strangles? Antibiotics do work against bacteria, and strangles is actually very susceptible to all sorts of antibiotics. The big problem we have is that strangles happens inside these lymph glands, and the lymph glands become abscesses. Abscesses have got walls of tissue around them, and actually in the middle, this big soup of thick pus where the live bacteria are living, the antibiotics just don't reach into that. They can't get from the bloodstream into the abscesses. So actually antibiotics in strangles are not only potentially, people have been concerned about causing bastard strangles and things like that, but actually the main thing is you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money, and you're injecting your horse needlessly. And if anything, you might be selecting for resistance, which is a problem in its own right with antibiotic resistance. So the main reason we recommend people don't use antibiotics is because they don't work where they need to work. And when people have tried antibiotics, what tends to happen is that the horse just ends up getting strangles. When you stop the antibiotics, the strangle starts up again. So nursing horses with strangles really focuses on making them as comfortable as possible. So getting a diagnosis, getting your vet involved, making sure at least that your vet's aware. Nursing, so things like hot compresses can really help. They can encourage the early rupture of abscesses. We've seen a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence that horses not only enjoy the comfort that a hot compress provides, but actually it does seem to allow abscesses to burst slightly quicker. And in complicated cases, the middle photo here, you can see that this poor pony had multiple abscesses all over her head, and each one of them was too small for us to lance. But actually what happened with the hot compresses was that we were able to get all of the little abscesses to burst. And the big thing is, while you're doing that, you can also sweep away a huge amount of pus. If you put that into your disinfectant, what you're also doing then is you're reducing the amount of strangles that ends up on the railings, in the shelter, in the water tanks, on your wood chip, in your paddocks, in your stables. So the more you can keep the horse clean and comfortable and happy, the more you're also reducing the amount of strangles in the environment to make the next horse at risk. And by nursing intensively, you can also look at those horses that maybe are going to need extra help from your vet, the ones that are going to need pain relief, the ones that might need antibiotics, and the ones that might need to be moved into a more specialist environment where your vets can provide more intensive care for them. For example, we've occasionally seen the need to make a hole in the windpipe, a tracheotomy, so the horse can breathe more easily because the lymph glands are so big that the horse is really struggling to breathe. So keeping a close eye on your horse means that when those horses need extra vet care, you're ready to get that vet care at the right time, rather than just saying that all horses need to have antibiotics and vets managing them every day of their infection. So do you need to stable horses with strangles? Well, what we found with our outbreak is that the horses will often choose to go somewhere warmer, so getting under the hedges, finding a sunny spot on a day. These things often happen in winter, so when you have a sunny day in winter, the horses will go and find a place to lie down in the sun. We had our outbreak start in February, and we noticed that our horses would either go into the shelter or around the back of the shelter where the sun was. Basically the same as we would do, finding something that can make you comfortable and help cope with the fever. So more often than not, people will have their horses stabled when they are sick. And so keeping the stable nice and spacious, having it well ventilated. Remember that strangles isn't an airborne disease, so that's fine. You just need to have good quarantine around the outside of your stable. A deep bed not only helps you sort of soak up the pus before it gets into the floor of the stable, but also stops it running out onto the yard, and it's more comfortable for your horse. And of course, making sure that they stay hydrated, so making water available for them. Sometimes we found in the middle of winter, slightly warming the water so it's not freezing cold can help, and raising the feed bowl, raising the water bowl, and then making sure also that, you know, if the horse is in solitary isolation, but normally that horse doesn't like being left alone, then you really do want to give them the opportunity to be able to have some kind of enrichment, whether that's a mirror or maybe just being able to see out onto the yard or looking out of the quarantine stable and seeing the other horses in the field. Something that takes into account that your horse's mental stimulation is also important in helping them recover. So the stages of an outbreak, hopefully you've already picked up on this from what I've told you about the disease itself, but effectively, we assume that when we have healthy horses that don't have a working immunity to strangles, that it will take them between 3 and 21 days to develop symptoms once strangles has got into their body. And really, the difference in those days is a combination of the strain of strangles, how much strangles the horse comes into contact with, the general health of the horse, and whether or not it's had strangles in the past. And all of these factors will decide whether or not you get strangles 2-3 days after the horse first contracted it. So you might have a horse that comes back from a show, and 3 days later, he's obviously not well. And other times it'll take weeks before the infection becomes recognized. And then it becomes harder for you to figure out how did it get onto the yard. Horses will be sick for sometimes only a matter of a few days, where once the abscesses have burst, they actually will look much better within 3-4 days. But usually it takes about a couple of weeks for them to start to feel much better, and for the lymph nodes to finish draining and the abscesses to actually start to heal over. But if you're thinking about things like still finding scabs under the skin or under the hair where the abscesses are healing over, and if you pick the scab, you'll still find pus underneath, we find that horses can easily be clinically affected by strangles for 8 weeks. And interestingly, when they've done post-mortems on horses for various reasons, they've still found live strangles bacteria in little abscesses, minute abscesses inside the lymph glands of the head, where they could get live strangles from those abscesses months after those horses were known to have had strangles. So in terms of persistence, strangles is actually a really, really tough beast inside a horse. And so these horses can still be contagious to other horses easily for 8 or more weeks after they have been ill themselves. And for those horses that become carriers, this can go on even longer. So one of the things I think is really important, try and keep strangles away from your horses. And if you get it coming into your horses, it's really worth trying to make sure that every horse that's been in the outbreak isn't contagious before you lift your quarantine, either to make sure your horse hasn't become a carrier, or to just check that your horse isn't still one of those that's got little abscesses in the back of its head that are still discharging just enough bacteria to make the next horse ill. So those horses, for example, would not be a good idea to take them to a show, because you could start an outbreak with the other horses that come to the show, for example. So if you're unlucky enough to be part of an outbreak, it's really important to actively look at what you can do afterwards. So what is a strangles carrier? Well, I think in some ways you could get a little bit sucked into the definition. Any horse that's had strangles that is still contagious to other horses could considered a carrier, but I think we can break those down to those 2 examples I've just given you. Those horses that will not have pus stuck in the guttural pouches, they are not going to be contagious for the rest of their life, but they might be contagious for a few months after they've had the infection. So if we scope them, the pouches would be visibly clean to look at. There's no chondroids, there's no obvious sign of an infection, but we can still get live bacteria from those horses. So those are the ones that I would call the convalescents, that are taking a long time. But basically any horse that fails to get rid of strangles from its head, once all of the symptoms elsewhere in the body have subsided, would be a carrier. And as long as the retained strangles inside that horse is able to survive, those horses can go on to cause outbreaks in other horses from time to time. And those are the ways in which strangles will suddenly pop out of nowhere on a new yard or in a new herd on a new stud. So what I'm going to do is play you our little animation. So that little animation has pretty much summarized most of my life for the last 6 months and on and off over the last 20 years. I don't know why you need me to do a long PowerPoint, really, because that's it. But I think it's discovering that horses can remain infectious to other horses because they are carriers. We had one horse before we figured out how to treat the guttural pouches that was on and off positive for 5 years before we realized how this whole thing works. So this is definitely the way in which Strangles will move around what appears to be healthy horses, and why it's so important to try and tidy up at the end of an outbreak. So what I'm going to do is treat you to a couple of pictures of what it looks like at the end of an endoscope. This is basically a little tube which either has an eyepiece on, so we can look straight down the tube, or it connects up to a video screen. So there's a tiny little video camera on the end, and we can actually put instruments down through the scope. And it's a really useful piece of kit for helping us identify carriers. What you'll see in one of the pictures here is that the little white stripes that you see in the top middle part of that picture on the left is the openings to the guttural pouch at the back of the horse's throat. And they are actually normally very difficult to get anything in and out of. So getting your scope in there is a bit of a trick that the vet has to learn. This photo is really useful to show that the tissues at the back of a horse's head and up the nose are very delicate, because in order to pick up the dust and the bacteria and the viruses, the membranes have to be really thin. So when your horse, for example, has a stomach tube up its nose for colic, it's not unusual for there to be a bit of a nosebleed afterwards, because these tissues are very, very delicate. And we'll see the same, that after we've been into a horse's head with an endoscope, it's often possible to see odd little tiny flecks of blood where we've bumped into the scope, into the back of the throat. That's perfectly normal. And even small amounts of blood like this are entirely normal and will clear up. So it's not something to be distressed about. The horse hasn't felt that, and actually that's just an indication of how sort of blood vessel rich the membranes of the horse's head are. But this is the entrance to the horse's right guttural pouch, and you can immediately see here that the left guttural pouch is draining some pus. And what's interesting is that this horse could be contagious to other horses, but you might never see a snotty nose, because that small amount of pus will disappear into the horse's stomach. So every time they swallow, that pus will be carried down into the horse's stomach and won't make its way down the horse's nose. But enough bacteria might easily get into the water tanks, and you can still cause an outbreak. So what will we find when we're inside the guttural pouch? Now, the guttural pouch behind these two little flaps are about the size of a tennis ball in the average sized cob. So somewhat bigger in a warm blood, somewhat smaller in a Shetland. But this chondroid here is a very old, dry chondroid. And they can be as big as this one, which is 4 centimeters across, and quite difficult to pull out. This would have been years old before we would have found it. And other times, I'll show you some photographs in a second of new chondroids that are actually very soft. But you can sometimes have no sign of any pus coming out of the horse's guttural pouch when you have really old and mature chondroids. And other times, when you see that little bit of pus, when you get into the horse's guttural pouch with the scope, you could find all sorts of things. So this is the floor of a guttural pouch that is otherwise looking really healthy. But what you will appreciate is this bulge that I'm trying to show you here with the mouse. And in this picture here, this is the floor of the guttural pouch, and you'll see the slightly more pink bulging area of the pouch. These are the lymph glands directly outside of the pouch that are suffering from a big abscess, and sooner or later they are going to burst. And the easiest way for them to burst is into the guttural pouch, rather than trying to find their way out through the skin of the horse. So it's only a matter of time before these two things are going to burst open, and then we will have the snot coming down the horse's nose. And what you then find is anything from a small amount of pus constantly draining out from these abscesses when they rupture, and then that will come down the horse's nose. And if people say, but surely this thing isn't so bad, the horses can cope with it, The other photograph here shows you a horse that had an infection that she wasn't able to shake off. So the strangles was lingering for months and months afterwards. And you can hopefully appreciate that these reddened areas are actually ulcers, where the nice pink layer, which should look a little bit like this on the other slide, has been eroded. So they have got ulcers. And if any of us have suffered from stomach ulcers, you'll know that they can be really painful. And this is all going on in the back of the horse's throat. So when these horses are off color, when maybe they start to behave strangely under saddle, one has to have some sympathy for them. And actually what's interesting is that once we managed to remove all the pus from this mare's throat, that recovered within a matter of days. And a few weeks later, she looked 100% normal again inside there. So in terms of having signs, I think we have to recognize that sometimes our horses won't tell us quite how miserable they're feeling when they've recovered from strangles. And it's important that we don't dismiss it as just one of those diseases that horses will get and then get over. And then we occasionally will see some horses that end up with really challenging and awkward long-term effects. So in a minute, I'll show you the typical ones with the small chondroids, but recently we've seen a few horses. So this is going into the guttural pouch. And instead of being able to see the pouch like this, where you can see the whole of the pouch with a bit of pus at the bottom, suddenly the pouch is nothing but thick custardy pus. And you can make holes in it with your scope, but you can't actually get any of this out. You can't flush it out, it's too thick. You can't grab hold of it because it's too crumbly. And in the end, this pony was only able to be helped by going for surgery, where we could actually physically find a way into the pouch big enough to get our hands into the head and actually scrape all of this stuff out. Obviously, that's a highly risky operation and it's expensive. And for the horse, it potentially could have led to a fatal hemorrhage, the loss of some important nerves. So one really does want to keep a close eye when horses are recovering from strangles and try and avoid it getting to the stage here where this ended up costing a huge amount of time and effort, some suffering for the pony and a lot of money to get this thing fixed. By and large, though, what we will find is that inside the head, the chondroids will be either forming into one single lump like this one, or into lots of lumps. And as the horse chews, it seems to be that this thick pus will mostly break down into smaller lumps, and then each one of them becomes what we call a chondroid. Now, when these chondroids are fresh, and by fresh, I would suggest probably less than a year old, when you go in with a scope, you try and grab hold of them, they usually just crumble. And then what you end up doing is crumbling them into small enough bits that you can rinse them out. But other times, what you will find is that you need to actually bring them out as a single piece. So this is the video of the scope going into the guttural pouch on the right-hand side of this horse's head. So we're using this tube to guide ourselves into the pouch. So you can see that the flap is actually very, very narrow, and it's difficult to push a scope in there, but we can get a thin tube down into the pouch. And once the tube is in, actually we can open the door of the pouch so that the whole scope can follow in. And once we've got the scope in, usually there's all sorts of rubbish on the windscreen. So we rinse our windscreen off a bit so that we can start to see. So quite a psychedelic moment there. And then suddenly we've got what actually looks like an incredibly healthy guttural pouch. But then we'll see that down there is one little chondroid. And that's all it takes for this horse to be contagious and start a new outbreak on the next place it goes to, the next horse he meets. So the techniques that we've evolved over the years involve using different kinds of baskets. This lovely little 8-wire memory wire basket makes it really easy to grab hold of. You can see that this chondroid's about to crumble and break into little bits, but if we can hold it nice and steady, what we'll do is we'll bring it back up against the scope so that while we're pulling it out of the pony's head, the scope protects it from breaking down into smaller chunks. And then we will rinse out the pouch, take any of the remaining bugs out with the flush, and then those horses will recover within a matter of days to become negative, where they can then go back out of quarantine. Here we have a similar case, and what you will see in this video, I think, is a slightly different one. No, it's the same one again. So I'm not going to waste your time. This is the one I wanted to show you. This is where you will see a tiny little chondroid again. It's floating in some of the solution that we've already washed into the pouch. And when we grab hold of it, you will see that it's very soft and gentle. And those can be quite difficult to bring out in one piece. And you can appreciate, so this basket that's opening up on the screen is probably about the size of a small hen's egg. So these chondroids can actually be absolutely tiny. So that's probably smaller than a raisin and is enough to start a new outbreak. And then before we wrap up, because otherwise we'll be here all night, I just want to talk to you about what you can do, both to keep strangles away when you're isolating a new arrival on the yard, and what you can do if you have an outbreak. Now, these rules are in many ways similar to any other infectious disease biosecurity protocol, but they will also be different. So for example, when it comes to strangles, wearing face masks for the horse isn't necessary because it's not an airborne infection. When it comes to equine flu, we have to think of equine flu more like COVID, because when the horses cough, the virus will be floating on the air, and it can go for even a mile down the road, just floating on the air, and it can float across to your neighboring yard, and flu can set up in the yard next door. So it's really important to recognize that the steps that you take will often have a lot in common, but they will be different based on the disease. So what will be common? So the main thing really will be to try and keep barriers between people and other horses and your quarantined animals, whether they are just being routinely screened as new arrivals or whether they are being protected as part of an outbreak. And those barriers will perhaps be 2 meters away for a horse with strangles. And with equine flu, it'll be at the gate of the yard, with the whole yard being isolated, trying to keep people as far away from the stables as possible. Disinfectants are really useful, but they are not magic water. So for example, spraying a bit of disinfectant on top of your wheelbarrow that's full of all the stuff that you've mucked out from the stable isn't going to disinfect anything at all. But what's better to do is to take your muck barrow to a muck heap without going through a part of the yard where there's a lot of wind, where half the stuff from the wheelbarrow gets sprayed across the yard. And that in order to get to the normal muck heap, everyone has to walk through your Strangles muck heap in order to get to the normal muck heap. So when it comes to things like disinfectant, really, it's most effective when it's either allowed to soak for long periods of time. So for example, when we take our overalls off, we'll leave them soaking for at least 20 minutes so that all the pus that's got onto the overalls can be disinfected. Or if we've cleaned the stable, then just a thin spray of disinfectant onto the clean stable will manage to kill off any viruses and bacteria that are left. So the equipment that we need is generally going to be the same, but how we use it is very dependent on the disease that we're trying to control. We find with strangles, it's really important to try and cover up as much of you as possible. So you could, in all honesty, muck out the strangles stable without overalls at all and just disinfect your boots on the way out. But that means you have to trust that the mucking out fork that you're using hasn't been touched by somebody else with strangles. Do you need to wear a hairnet when you're doing this? No. But if you are in a stable with a horse that's got strangles, we all know that when they're feeling a bit better, they're probably going to come over to say hello. They're going to probably want to nuzzle you, give you a cuddle, and suddenly you discover that the back of your ponytail is full of snot. So we have to be much more alert to the specific risks and then take our isolation steps accordingly. So being prepared with overalls and gloves and disinfectant really is a good way to start. And then you can utilize and kind of tidy up your actual biosecurity with the help of your vet to kind of focus in on what's really going to be the most effective for the disease. So with strangles, we really just encourage people, use the tools that are in quarantine, put fresh overalls on when you go in, don't touch the horses, don't take anything out of quarantine that isn't thoroughly disinfected. So for example, feed bowls have to be disinfected properly and then taken out so that we can put new food in, but we don't take the wheelbarrows out, we don't take the forks out. And then remember that you can isolate very successfully outdoors as well. So really the mainstay of our isolation at Redwings is 2 big black buckets, rubbish bins with lids that fit. One is full of clean overalls and one is full of disinfectant that as soon as we've finished, we take the overalls off and we put them in the disinfectant solution. And we then put fresh overalls on if we go back in. We have the chain to keep people outside the area. So proper signs, a proper barrier, a good foot dip, somewhere to put your rubbish, whether it's clinical waste separately, and a bin that you can disinfect stuff in. And then try and leave things like the horse's food that they're going to eat inside the quarantine area and don't bring it back out. And you'll see here even that we have our bucket from the JCB into which we put our muck. And at the end, we cover that over and that gets taken away every couple of days or every day and put at a separate muck heap. So people looking after the horses in quarantine don't have to leave the isolation area at all. So what I'm going to do is skip this. And just very briefly talk about testing. There's 2 ways in which we test. One is to try and manage an outbreak, so finding out, how far is Strangles spread through the herd. And the other is to try and screen horses before they get onto a yard to try and protect everybody else on the yard from catching Strangles from a new horse that might have Strangles. And it's important to recognize why we're testing, because that can often tell us what's the most cost-effective test to do, when to do the test. And then we have to remember that we can collect one sample and we can test that in different ways. So first and foremost, looking at the horse, doing a good physical examination, things like taking their temperature is a really big way of understanding whether or not we need to put the horses in isolation, but it won't tell us why we're putting them in isolation. If we take blood tests, at the moment, Strangles blood test can only look for antibodies that the horse produces. And in order to produce antibodies, they need to have had Strangles for at least 10 days for us to measure them. So there's no point doing a blood test on day 1 unless we want to compare that with a blood test 3 weeks later, for example. So blood tests look for antibodies, so they measure how well the horses become immune to Strangles. So it's not always the best test, for example, to find a carrier. And if we take a blood test on a horse that had Strangles 3 weeks ago, we're going to get a high blood test. So it won't tell us whether or not that horse is still contagious, because all we're doing is looking for antibodies. So if we go into the horse's nose and try and get samples there, we'll be much easier to figure out whether we've got actual Strangles, and we can look for Strangles as a live bug, and we do that by culturing it. So culturing tests are basically like growing your seedlings and seeing what seedling turns out. So is that going to be a sunflower or a cauliflower? It takes a while to culture, and Strangles is actually quite tricky to culture in the lab. So whether you get a piece of snot with a swab or collected using a scope, that sample, if it's cultured, will not be the most reliable. And what we found the best test, and you'll all know this term now, is a PCR. So whether we take the swab or whether we take our scope sample, if we test it for PCR, it will be very, very good at picking up even the slightest hint of any Strangles that's left in that horse. So really what we think we need people to do more of is to get their horses scoped, because your guttural pouch can be sampled. We squirt a bit of water into the pouch and then we suck it back up and then we send that to the lab. And if we get a positive PCR, we know that there's a chance that that horse is contagious, because we won't find a PCR positive horse that doesn't have live bacteria in its head or would have had it very recently. So basically, the gold standard for diagnosing whether a horse could be contagious is to take a PCR test off a sample collected from both guttural pouches. But again, we've got to remember that incubation period, it could take up to 3 weeks for the horse's guttural pouches to become infected enough for us to detect it. So there's not much point spending money getting your vet to scope your horse when the horse in the stable next door started strangles the night before. You do need to use your tests with your vet's guidance at the right stage of the disease in order to actually get value for money from your sampling. And because this is a complicated area, it's really important that you ask questions of your vet, come to us, read up what's available online so that you can understand what tests you might need to do given the circumstances with your horse, and whether you're trying to screen, whether you're trying to check after an outbreak, or whether you're trying to diagnose why your horse has got a snotty nose. And so I'll just finish off here. You can see that with our outbreaks and our routine screening at Redwings for quarantine, here we're using a tiny little scope designed for humans, and we don't have one of these anymore. They're very expensive and really tricky to maintain. But most modern scopes will now fit into the smallest pony heads very comfortably, but they go up into the nose, into the guttural pouches, and it allows the vet to look at what's going on in the throat, in the guttural pouches, and also to collect samples. And we can also do treatments like the ones that you've seen earlier through the scope. So it's a really useful way of managing all aspects as a vet of strangles. And you'll see here that from the horses we've examined, we were able to fix carriers with one scoping session, and then would only have to scope them once more in order to test that they were negative. We had a few more of the complicated ones that needed 2 to 3 to 5 scoping sessions to fix their problem. That's when they would have perhaps 10 or 20 chondroids. And then we'd have a few that really had either hundreds of chondroids that needed more than 5 scoping sessions, or where we went to surgery to finally fix the problem for them. And they were a very small percentage of our cases, but we have successfully treated a few horses with surgery. And I think what I will do is leave it there, because I think it's important to have time for your questions. There are links in the chat for you to follow to the various research updates. And this presentation is also available for you to watch. The next stage, parts 4 and 5 are actually available online in a presentation that's exactly the same as what I've got here. And I can answer any questions by popping back into the presentation if your question relates to what would come next, but I'm conscious otherwise we'll be here till sunset. So if I now see what questions you guys have for me, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Nick. That was a really interesting talk, and I had a couple of questions jotted down, but you've answered them as we've gone along. But there seem to be a couple of questions in the chat. So, first one from Pauline, and Pauline's asked 2 questions. The first one is, how long do infected horses need to stay in isolation for? And how do you know once your infected horse has got the all clear and is able to leave isolation?
So I think this is the tricky bit about how do you spend your money wisely. Chances are that 6 weeks after your horse has recovered from strangles, they will no longer be contagious in most cases. But I would say that really is information that's based on young horses 2 to 3 years of age that had no immunity to strangles, caught the traditional, got strangles, got really sick, got over it a couple of days later, had a snotty nose, had 1 or 2 abscesses, bounced back very quickly. The chances of older horses that maybe have Cushing's, maybe have been in parts of the world where strangles is more common, so they might have had strangles before. It's a lot harder to answer that, because those are the very cases we're finding where the horse turns out to be a carrier. So the horse with the world record number of chondroids came to us from a home where the owner was pretty confident the horse had never had strangles, and yet he had 220 chondroids that we counted. And in the end, we could only find them by doing surgery. That's the only way we could get them all out. And yet no one had ever noticed that he'd had strangles. We're seeing a lot of horses that have very mild forms of strangles, and yet when you stick the scope in their head, they've got huge amounts of pus stuck inside there. And we've got other horses that have got really horrible signs of strangles, and inside the pouches are whistle clean, and they recover very quickly. So we do believe that some of the strains circulating in the UK will probably give you different types of infection. The trouble is we can't test for strains. It's a very expensive test, and the only way that it's being done at the moment is when cultures that are done at certain labs are put into a freezer and then run at a research laboratory 2 or 3 times a year. And getting into those research labs is very expensive and very difficult. So it's not something an owner can do. So we don't yet have a very clear link between the strain and how severe the disease and maybe how bad the risk is. But you might have heard people say that, oh, the blood test doesn't work anymore. Well, actually, people are often trying to get results from blood tests that haven't taken into account all of the circumstances. So maybe they haven't looked at the timing of the blood test. They haven't looked at the history of the blood test. But one of the things we've recognized is that the infections that we are seeing pop up all over the UK, the early work done a few years ago showed that one of the strains that's now becoming more common isn't provoking an immune system reaction, so that the horse's antibodies are not there for that test to work. So the test is so clever and so specific that if there's even the slightest change in the strain, the antibodies the horse produces change a bit, and therefore the test doesn't pick them up. And actually there's work going on. The Animal Health Trust had a new test lined up, but when they went under, that work was stopped. But thankfully the university in Sweden is continuing that work, and I would hope that by the end of this year we will have a new combination of things to test for, so that the blood test will again be relevant to the strains that are looking like the strains that we're seeing in England and much of Europe are somewhat different to what we used to have and what's still very common in Australia and America. So the short answer is the best thing you can do once your horse is recovered from strangles is to get your vets to scope them. If you scope them really early, what you can do is you can literally just connect your scope up to a source of water and you can hose them out. And you can just rinse that pus out and it slides down the nose like a gloopy little bug, you know, the slimy stuff, and it'll run down the horse's nose into the bucket full of disinfectant, and that's the job done. So you don't have to worry about chondroids. You don't have to decide if the chondroids are soft and crumbly or if the whole pouch is full of stuff. The downside is that some of those horses will continue to form pus, and you might have to scope your horse more than once to get rid of all of the loose pus. But what we've found is that if you 10 days after your horse has no longer got physical signs of strangles, you can still rinse that pus out because it'll still be slimy, and all you need is a bit of water. If you wait 3 to 4 weeks, most of the horses who would have got rid of that slimy pus by themselves, just by having their head down and eating off the floor, will have fixed themselves. So you might have saved yourself some money not scoping that horse, but now you might find that that pus has started to become thicker and drier, and now your vet has to start spending 2 hours fudging around inside your horse's head, crumbling that pus up. And if they haven't got all the equipment with them, they might have to come back, and suddenly it's 2 vet visits, two longer sessions. So I think in the end, it's a discussion you need to have with your vet. Generally, vets in private practice find that if owners scope their horses 3 weeks after the symptoms have recovered, most of the horses that don't need treatment will be negative by then and will have sorted themselves out. And that owner doesn't have to spend any more money, but then they have to put more work into those horses that have stayed positive, that are now carriers. And one of the things I would suggest people consider doing, if you have an outbreak on the yard, you, between yourselves, let's say there's 10 of you, you just say, right, when are we going to get our horses scoped? And maybe we all agree we can't all afford to do them 3-4 times. Maybe what we'll do is we'll scope them at the 3-week mark, but that we all put money into the kitty so that for those 2 people whose horses maybe need more scopings, everyone chips in for the vet costs of that, because the 8 people whose horses are clear have benefited from waiting. So they've saved money, but actually they've put those 2 other owners at risk of a much higher vet bill because they didn't scope at 10 days. So you could have that conversation with your vet, and actually, you know, this is coming back to the theme of being better horse keepers, is working as a community. You could kind of go, let's share the costs of this whole thing amongst ourselves, and let's come up with a decision. We're going to scope at 10 days or 2 weeks, and we will all chip in and help for the next couple of vets that have to come out for the 2 or 3 horses that need a bit more work. And by doing that, of course, everyone is going to benefit. And that way, the timing of when you do your follow-ups really boils down to what's right for your yard, what's right for your horses. If it was an individual horse and your vet is had scopes on a regular basis, I would suggest that you encourage them to do it sooner rather than later. And I would say 10 days afterwards, but they will have their reasons why they might want to do it later. And that's why you need to speak to your own vets each time.
That's super. Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you, Pauline, for that question. I think it's very, very much a conversation with your vet, isn't it? And we're working together with the other people on the yard. That's important there. Looks like we've got another question.
Yes.
Is it just horses, or can donkeys be infected with strangles too?
Yeah, so we used to ignore our donkeys, patting ourselves on the back. Oh, that's a bit of work saved. New donkeys, don't have to worry. But then evidence was emerging, first through the donkey sanctuary, and then with the international research going on, that donkeys can get strangles. They seem to get it less easily than horses, and they seem to get over it better, but they have found quite a few donkeys that become carriers. And so, yes, donkeys are at risk, and we do screen donkeys that come to Redwings routinely, and we scope all new horses that arrive at Redwings, and so we scope our donkeys as well. The donkey sanctuary will scope those donkeys that come from high-risk environments where there's a history of strangles, or when the international donkeys have various blood tests for international diseases, and that often they will do strangles on top of that. So they have a risk-based approach. But in terms of protecting your donkeys, what we've seen, donkeys with the donkey skin trade, with donkey milk being popular in China, donkey farms in China have recognized that strangles there has evolved to become very aggressive, and their donkeys are getting very sick, almost more sick than horses with strangles. So there's a concern that there's a strain that has found a way of infecting donkeys more easily. And therefore, it is important to protect your donkeys. We haven't got, the new vaccine isn't tested in donkeys, but in theory, donkeys should be protected with all the steps that you take to protect horses. So your screening, your biosecurity measures, your isolation will work for donkeys as well as any other horse. And it's worth doing because, yes, they can get it, and they can also start new outbreaks when they move to a new yard.
Thank you. That's good. I think we've got another question now. They're going to keep coming now. So we've got a question here from Rowan saying, the antibody blood tests seem to have quite a high sensitivity. Heard people say that they've identified horses with a borderline level of antibodies, which means they have to spend more money on testing. Does this put owners off testing? Is there a way around this? Many livery yards now insist on it, which is great. But Rowan is wondering if some owners may be reluctant to enter into prolonged testing when the horses seem healthy and to the best of their knowledge have not been exposed.
It's a great question and a tricky one, but I'll try and be brief. So hopefully some of what I've said just now about the blood test will give you some idea, but the blood test will do one thing and one thing only. It'll pick up antibodies that the blood test is designed to pick up. Not all blood tests are equal either. So there's some blood tests that will pick up all sorts of stuff. So when you get new strains of strangles, it'll probably pick those up, but it'll also pick up other diseases that look very similar to strangles. So you'll get a positive blood test when it's not really strangles. Others, like the Animal Health Trust test that they had developed, is very focused on only strangles, antigen A and antigen C. And what we're finding is that there are problems because of the change in the strain, that the test isn't always picking up, because even one horse with the same strain of strangles, you will get different blood test results because different horses will produce different amounts of antibody A and antibody C against antigen A and antigen C. So the antigens are the bit of the strangles. So if you imagine, if you had to give someone your address, you've got your house number, your home address, your street, your village, your county, your country, and then you could put your continent. And if you're giving your address to an alien, you'd have to say planet Earth. So along all of that, the DNA of Strangles has got all of these addresses, and antigen A and antigen C is your house number and your postcode. So it's pretty accurate. Other tests will pick up that you live in Norfolk. And what we're hoping to do is that the new blood test will pick up the strains in England or the UK, where, because antigen A and antigen C are struggling, we think that antigen A is still very relevant. And the new antigen, let's call it antigen X, will actually take us from beyond the village and the postcode down to the house number again and say, yes, this blood test is Strangles. But if you've got a horse with a weakened immune system, or a horse that had Strangles previously, like in the last year or so, and they've bumped into Strangles, they could have a really high blood test but not have Strangles. So some of the horses in our outbreak had really high blood tests, but they'd had Strangles when they were in Ireland before they came over to us. So their immune system was still ready to go. So they didn't show symptoms, but they had very quick blood results. So what you've got to recognize is that you will be able to detect antibodies in any horse that's had an exposure to Strangles more than 10 days ago. And if you don't know the story for that horse, you can't really interpret those bloods very well. So if you take two bloods 2 weeks apart, then if one test is low and the next test is medium, or one is medium and the next one's high, then there's a chance that your horse is in the middle of Strangles. If the test goes down a bit, then you could think, okay, maybe my horse is recovering from Strangles. And if it's really high in a horse with no symptoms, maybe it's just come out of a Strangles outbreak and they've chosen not to tell you, or your horse is a carrier. And then we have to recognize that, like ponies that have been carriers for 2-3 years, there's a chance that actually their immune system in the end just kind of goes, nah. And the blood tests will start to have lower and lower levels that it's detecting, and yet your horse is still positive, and your horse might still be contagious to other horses. So the blood test, if you get a result on the blood test, the thing you probably need to do then is get your horse scoped. So horses where people have reacted to the blood test and done further tests, a lot of people have then found out that their horse is okay, but they've also found carriers which have stopped new outbreaks. So horses being imported, for example, into the United Arab Emirates, because they were buying horses from very reputable people in the UK. And the next thing you know, their entire yards were going down with Strangles because they'd imported a carrier. So they now insist on blood screening, and then they scope all the horses that aren't negative on bloods. And they've identified carrier after carrier after carrier. So the blood test does find carriers, but we just have to recognize that there are so many things that go into a blood result that it's not the silver bullet to give you your answer that you need. For example, new horses coming onto yards. One of the reasons we scope at Redwings is, one, the scoping test is much more reliable. It's the gold standard. Two, our vets are good at it, so we can scope. It takes longer to clean the scope than it does for the vet to go up both pouches and collect the samples. We can do that in 5-6 minutes. And we sedate our horses for scoping, but when they arrive at Redwings, we sedate them to look at their teeth properly as well, so they get a really thorough dental. And of course, a horse moving yards might just have had its teeth done 6 months ago, so it doesn't need another dental. So scoping then would seem like, okay, I've got to have my horse sedated again. So it's important to kind of, again, work out. It's so important that livery yard owners work with their vets and make sure that the testing that they ask people to do works for them. And I think it's probably better if people were to let new horses come to the yard and have a decent quarantine area for the horses to arrive. That's a nice stable, a nice paddock. Because once the horse is on their yard, they know their yard's clean. They know the horse can't catch Strangles once he gets to their yard. And then to take a blood test after 3 weeks, because then they know that whatever's on the blood comes with a horse that hasn't caught Strangles a few days ago before it came to the yard. So the strategies that yards develop need to not rely on the blood test doing everything for them. And that's why I think people are getting justifiably frustrated that the blood test is costing them money, and then they're doing more blood tests and they're going nowhere fast, and they can't get off the one yard and they can't get onto the next yard. So it's important that I think yards, to protect other horses on the yard, it's great that they're asking for testing, but what they really need to do is come up with a testing plan that works for the horses coming on their yard. And that might be different. So they might have different rules for different horses. I would argue, for example, that in a couple of years' time, with the new vaccine, a valid vaccine certificate and 2 weeks isolation would be all they need. So vaccinated horses could still get strangles. They could still maybe spread strangles, but we hope that actually a well-vaccinated, recently vaccinated horse will probably not be that contagious. But if they've been vaccinated and they go for 2 weeks quarantine on the yard, not 3, that might be perfectly ideal. So I think yard owners really need to keep their plans up to speed with the latest evidence and the latest tools available, because even the existing vaccine, if that's used correctly, will protect that horse when it comes onto a yard. So it's really important that yards have strategies that are very much dynamic and responsive.
That's super. Thanks very much, Nick. Some really good advice there for horse owners and livery yard owners too. I think that's all the questions answered now. I can't see any more coming in. I'll just have a quick double check. No, I think that's it.
Okay, what I'll do then is, maybe if I may, I will just share one screen. No, that's, sorry, starting the whole talk again. You don't want that. I want to just do the temp check challenge. Really, the theme of this year's Strangles Awareness Week is to get everybody to actively participate. So if you just have a quick look at this slide, I just want you to have a look and recognize that actually what we found, Carol Hall did a study in Nottingham Trent University with horses that were on that yard for a long period of time, and found that the normal temperature for some horses was actually a lot lower than we would recognize. So for a horse who's normally got a consistent temperature of 36, which might be too low for other horses, that horse might be considered to have a fever when it gets to 37.5, 38. Everybody in the veterinary world does acknowledge that horses that have got a temperature of 38.7 and above are probably getting into some kind of bother. But what we're doing during Strangles Awareness Week is getting people to go to the online tool, and it'll be one of the links that you can click all over the show. It'll be all over the Redwings pages. It'll be all over the social media. You can enter your horse's name and your details, and you can enter a competition. You can buy a thermometer with free postage and packaging from us. But what we're really keen is that people spend the week taking their horse's temperature morning and evening at the same time of day before exercise. So there's consistency, because a bit of exercise, all of that can dramatically affect the temperature reading, and that people do at least 3 days of readings and enter those into the temp checker. They will get all their results back for themselves, but also this will give us a much better idea of how many horses in the UK have a normal temperature that's maybe lower than this 37.5 that we always quote when we say what's the normal temperature for a horse. And if you can do just this one little thing, you will be basically engaging fully as part of the Strangles Awareness Week this year, and you will have become an ambassador for the Strangles, Stamp Out Strangles campaign. So I think it would be a great thing for you to do, not only to help you better understand your own horse, but actually to help everybody else learn what normal is for horses in the UK. And hopefully you can have a bit of fun doing it. And I know that the SRUC students have actually engaged in all sorts of little social media treats that are going to come our way during the week. And thank you very much for doing that, because I think it's probably one of the cheapest tools that we've got to figure out how healthy our horses are. And I think all of us do it far too little. And maybe this can prompt us to basically start just checking our horse's temperature a bit more normally again. So thanks for your time and letting me sort of just throw that in as well.
No, thank you very much, Nick. It's been a really interesting afternoon. Thank you for a fantastic presentation, and thank you for answering our questions as well. So I think I can speak on behalf of everyone here to say that we just really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak this afternoon, and we hope that everybody will get on board with Strangles Awareness Week and look at the website. We've got some thank yous coming in at the bottom in the chat. So
it's an absolute pleasure. And just remember that the Redwings website's hosting a lot of this, but this Awareness Week really is everybody's contribution. You know, Strangles is not a Redwings thing. This is about all of us. So it's fabulous. You know, this week's only possible through the huge amount of commitment from everyone, including yourselves, Alison herself, and I think it's going to, over time, make a real difference to our horses in the UK.
Yeah, definitely. I think people are becoming much more aware, and I think through events like this where you're giving us up-to-date information, it's really helpful, and it's allowing horse owners and yard owners to make informed decisions about the care of their horses. And can I just thank all the participants who've come along, taken the time to come along and join us this afternoon. Much appreciated. Please spread the word. This talk has been recorded, so it will go on to SRUC's YouTube, onto our Facebook pages. So we will upload the video there. So anybody who hasn't had the chance to watch it live will be able to watch it back, and take on board some of the advice that Nick's given us this afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone. Much appreciate you joining us, and thanks again, Nick, for a really informative and interesting afternoon. Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure.